You're listening to the 10-2 Blue Brief, a podcast by the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association. Hello to everyone that's tuning in for our podcast today. I'm Chuck Dowd. I'm a retired assistant chief from the New York City Police Department. I was involved in the effort that resulted in the creation of FirstNet with a whole bunch of other great folks from public safety. We formed an organization very early on in the 2008 timeframe at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference, the Public Safety Alliance, which was the entity that got public safety behind the effort that led to FirstNet. Today, we're going to interview Chief Chris Moore. Chief Chris Moore was Chief of Police in San Jose, California. He was the guy that led the PSA for us. And I'm going to let Chris introduce himself. Now, Chris, please take it away.
Thanks, Chuck. It's an honor to be with you today, as it is always an honor to be hanging out with Chuck Dowd. Again, I am Chris Moore. I'm the retired Chief of Police from the city of San Jose in Northern California, the heart of Silicon Valley. I did 33 years in law enforcement and have been involved in public safety issues for the last 45 years, along with great people like Chuck and others. And as Chuck had mentioned, that we're going to talk a little bit today, I think, about how he and I became friends and how we started this journey together to try and bring a nationwide public safety broadband network for public safety in the United States. And I think it was one of these great success stories, but it started with a couple of folks talking about an idea that needed to happen. And I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Thank you, Christopher. Chris is my brother from another mother, from 3,000 miles apart. We met at that conference for the first time in person. We had talked a number of times prior on conference calls as we tried to figure out a strategy, a go-forward strategy to create a nationwide public safety network. And we didn't know at the time what that was going to look like, what was going to be involved, but we knew we needed one. So Chris and I met for the first time again at that conference in San Diego, California, and have become fast friends ever since then. And Chris, I'm going to let you tell the story a little bit about how we met that day and how that first day that you and I were given the responsibility to formulate a strategy, a go-forward strategy for a nationwide network. Chris, if you don't mind sharing that.
Not at all. And I'll take it back just a little bit further, just for context, for those who have been involved in this for a long time. The need for data in public safety has grown significantly over the last 20 years. We knew that we didn't have we had LMR networks that were very, very, they were good at what they did. They just didn't provide us what we needed with respect to the oncoming onslaught of data. There was an effort early on before the PSA and before I met Chuck, headed up by Harlan McEwen, another person who's been incredibly influential, was chair of the IECP's Communications and Technology Committee, and really been working on broadband for public safety for a long time. They had tried an effort to make something like this happen in the 2008 timeframe with some spectrum, was known as the D block, and they had an auction. The FCC had an auction conditioned on providing public safety this type of network, and that auction failed in April of 2008. Then the question was, what next? What do we do? And Chuck and I had been talking on the phone, figuring out, he in New York City, who had one of the largest networks and clearly had, charted a path that may not have served. It may have served New York City, but it may not, been translatable to the rest of the country. So he and I had been chatting. We end up at the Major City Chiefs Conference, which was at the same time as IECP in the late October of 2008, trying to figure out what we should do. Chuck and I had met. We were asked by the executive director, Tom Frazier, who's a former police commissioner in Baltimore and a cops director and spent his career, a good chunk of his career in San Jose. Anyway, so I knew Tom, and we had approached Tom, say, look, we need major cities, the board of major cities, to write a letter to the FCC chair asking him to postpone any auction of the D block spectrum until public safety could regroup. Told that, hey, we were not going to lunch with the rest of the group. We were going to be writing this letter. And then, in fact, Chuck and I did do that. And then we presented to the board and explained it to him. Now, the interesting thing was back then, a lot of the folks in major cities didn't really necessarily understand what the D block was or what spectrum, that kind of thing, and what the import was. So we did a pretty good job sort of educating them and asking them at least to write the letter so that at least we didn't lose the opportunity for the use of the D block in the future. So in fact, they passed that motion. The letter was sent to the FCC chair. And at that point, as Tom Frazier said to me, I said, well, great, that's great. What now? And he reminded me of the old, call it the Pottery Barn rule that Colin Powell had invoked, is you break it, you own it. So guess what? He says, you guys broke it. Let's, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, Chris. So that was an interesting thing because, as he pointed out to us, it was easy to break it, right? It was a whole nother thing to fix it. In other words, what do you do now? Why don't you take a little bit about, what happened then and how we developed the PSA, right?
So at that point, if you realize you're going to take on a nationwide effort, and again, this is a significant ask. If you're going to build a nationwide network, the question is, do you build it on your own? Do you have money from the federal government that, quite frankly, the state and locals didn't have to do this? And you had spectrum. It takes not only spectrum, but it also takes money. But money is secondary to spectrum. Without spectrum, you got nothing. You can throw all the money you want at, but if you don't have the highway, you don't have the airwaves. So we had to get that. Getting everybody on board from all the associations that mattered, and I say that all associations matter, but the large nationwide organizations, we drew up a list to include groups like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, ICP, International Association of Fire Chiefs, Major City Chiefs, Major County Sheriffs, National Sheriffs Association, National Association of Emergency Management Officials or Emergency Medical Services, EMS. A bunch of other groups that were important to public safety and had an interest in this, get the main players in the room to number one, discuss, is this even relevant to everybody, or is it a priority for people? So we got the main group together in April of 2009 in DC at the then Renaissance Hotel on 9th Street, and brought just the leadership. And it's really a critical thing that we learned is that you can't have just government relations people from these organizations. You had to have the leadership, and that meant we only invited the president, the vice president, and the executive director from each of these associations. These people had the authority to make decisions for the organizations, to determine and provide input, and then determine what, if anything, we were going to do with this issue moving forward. So in that day in April, we brought everybody into DC, laid it out. We weren't sure. A lot of people were skeptical that anything like this could be done because it had been tried and didn't work in that form under the PSSA. Notwithstanding that the effort was a good effort, and hats off to those people, including Harlan, that made that happen. It just needed a broader approach. So we got everybody in the room, and the first question was, folks, this is our opportunity. Is it important enough to you on a nationwide scale to take this on as a priority for your organization? And I wasn't really sure what the answer was going to be, but we had to ask the question. And to both Chuck and my surprise and delight that they said, yes, it is important and we will support it. You got to first of all understand these are all associations that have their own constituencies, their own priorities. This was the first time ever, and quite frankly, since where everybody was on the same page that we needed to do it, and the question was how to do it and who's going to lead it. Major City Chiefs, since we had, as an organization, started the effort, was asked to lead it. I was asked to step into the role of leader for this group, which I was honored to do. But I will tell you frankly, it was because Chuck's effort early on that we were even in a position to do what we did. So
what was unique about this going forward was that we got everybody in public safety on the same page, and that had never happened before, right, historically. One of the concerns that I had early on, and it was a concern for Major City Chiefs, was, look, New York City will get what it needs, right? It always gets what it needs, kind of thing. But, and you and I had discussed this very early on, that this either worked for everybody, for the small towns, for the small cities, for the rural counties. Either it works for everybody or it doesn't work. So one of the things that was decided was that it was important not to have the guy who was representing from the biggest city in the country leading this, because it could send the wrong message. Chris, could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, Tom Frazier and I had mentioned, look, Chuck had taken a lot of the slings and arrows from folks over the years to get us started down this path. But because a large portion of this country, small rural jurisdictions could never afford to do something like this. And they were concerned that, the big cities would basically take this thing over. And so just having major cities run it or this effort or coordinate it had an optic to it that they wanted to be mindful of. And so part of that was one of the reasons why I think Chuck was probably, although a major player in doing this with me as a partner, they had me lead it. But we also had another couple of folks that were core to the effort. We've been named a couple different things over the years, some more flattering than others, but I think they ended up with the four horsemen. And that was Jeff Johnson from the International Association of Fire Chiefs, who was then the president of that organization. And then Dick Murgon, who then was the president of APCO, the Association of Public Safety Communications Officials International. Anyway, APCO, the four of us, Chuck, myself, Dick, and JJ, Jeff Johnson, sort of formed a core. Now, even though we drove a lot of what went on, we had weekly calls with everybody. And the key to the decision making and the success of this project and this effort was everybody had to agree. There had to be consensus. And getting consensus among a large group of people is difficult at best. In a very large nationwide effort, there was real concern that, if one group wanted to go off on their own because they felt they could, you're a major organization, nobody should be telling you what you should and shouldn't say. But we got everybody to agree is, look, the only way we're successful here is if we all agree. If some group goes off on one direction, Congress is going to look at us and say, you guys can't even agree. How can you expect us to agree? So we agreed early on to say that, look, we will make no decisions unless it's a consensus amongst all of us. Difficult, very difficult. That said, people understood the value. And it's not to say we didn't have disagreements. Frankly, Chuck and I would have disagreements. JJ and I we would all have our own viewpoint. And the organizations would weigh in and say, we can't live with that. We want to do this. The key and the magic was just to get everybody who was reasonable and thoughtful to come in and say, okay, what is the bottom line consensus that we can agree to, and go with that. And as we got further along, we trusted each other because none of us knew each other really to speak of, at least I didn't. And we got to trust each other and say, okay, as somebody would come up with a proposal, we discuss it, people would add into it, and then we come to some sort of resolution on consensus.
So would you say this was less about personalities and more about goal-oriented? What are we trying to accomplish here, right?
That was the clarity of the goal was number one. Number two, take the titles out of it. Take, our organization's bigger than yours. That's not the point. The point is, what is public safety writ large nationwide? And we all agreed on that. And so given that, how do we approach moving forward? And as you mentioned, Chuck, it's not about personalities. In fact, and that's difficult because personalities tend to infect a lot of these types of larger organizations, people that were true leaders or natural leaders, whatever. But everybody was either a president or a representative of these, and a sitting chief or CEO. So we all have our egos, we all have our thoughts, but everybody understood how important this was, and we can't let the egos get in the way of, and the personalities get in the way of getting the job done. And that's exactly what we were able to do, which, given the group, I was very impressed and honored to work with such a great group of people.
Yeah, Chris, well said. So moving forward from that, we had some brush fires, and then we had the major battle, which ended up in Congress, right? Let's talk about a little bit about, initially, our initial focus was at the Federal Communications Commission and our attempts to get them to do this, because we know that the FCC has the authority to issue or to license the spectrum, and could have done this to public safety, but it didn't happen. So can you talk a little bit about that relationship with the FCC and how we tried to develop it?
For those who aren't familiar with sort of spectrum allocation, the FCC is charged with nationwide, the allocation of spectrum. There are some nuances with respect to government spectrum as opposed to commercial spectrum, but the FCC overall is the agency that is responsible for that. The FCC also has in its charter and its mandate to make sure that public safety has what it needs. And so they do listen to public safety, and they actually have a bureau, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. So we thought it best to approach the FCC leadership at that time and say, okay, yes, the auction failed. Yes, we still need a network. How do we move this forward, and what does it look like? And they were open to our suggestions, but there came a point when the then chair and I don't need to use his name because people can look back if they want to, and it's less relevant. It's that people just didn't think public safety was important enough to allocate this large chunk of spectrum, because they didn't think we would be able to utilize it efficiently and have this network come to life as we saw it. And so they basically politely told us, frankly, go talk to the carriers, see what they'll do for you. And the carriers were kind, but they're in business to make money, and they just did not have any interest in providing us with what we really needed, which was ruthless preemption for the spectrum when we needed it, where we needed it, which isn't very often when we needed that much of it, but when we need it, we need it. So we were basically, I will say, blown off by the FCC. We just were ignored, in effect.
Chris, so again, it was interesting. There was at one point where we had a meeting. You recall that meeting at the museum, a museum in Washington D.C. Could you just touch a little bit on that and how? I think that's the point that we realized that the FCC was not the place we were going to be able to accomplish this. So can you touch on that?
Absolutely, yeah. So this was a meeting because we were at loggerheads with them. The Police Executive Research Forum, and led by Chuck Wexler, convened a meeting at, like Chuck said, at the museum, the newer version of what was then the museum down there off Pennsylvania Avenue. And we invited the FCC, head of the Public Safety Homeland Security Bureau, that was Admiral Jamie Barnett, and we had all of the major city chiefs that were invited and other participants from some of the other organizations in the Public Safety Alliance. And basically they told us, hey, this is what you get. You have days, if not hours, to accept what we're going to do. It was really a mandate to us, basically just throwing it back in our face. And a couple of eloquent speakers, I would say Bill Lansdowne, who was then the chief in San Diego, and my former boss in San Jose, said, Admiral, we appreciate your service, but that's not going to work for us. And in effect, told the FCC, okay, if you're not going to work with us, we'll move on a different direction. And that's when we ended up going to Congress. And again, another huge challenge, something that, as Jeff Johnson says, hey, if we knew it was going to be this difficult, we may not have done it. The other side of it, too, is if we had just been asked, if the carriers had just done what we'd asked, which is provide us, a service level agreement, in effect, which gave us what we needed, when we needed it, where we needed it, and we'd pay for it. But they just said, you're just not that important.
It was important. I think their answer was they were more focused on their commercial obligations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And we have in public safety, right, correctly so, a different mandate, right?
Yeah,
So that's, I think, when Congress began to realize, and the White House at the time began to realize that this may need to go in a different direction than getting the carriers to do it. So can you remember that critical meeting we had in DC, in Herndon? Yeah. Can you touch on that one?
Sure. So we had, to your point, Chuck, we had spent time on the Hill. We realized we needed to go to Congress, but we needed our own bill. We needed a bill, and the bill hadn't, couldn't even get anybody to introduce a bill to reallocate the D block to public safety. That was a challenge. But through the effort of Chuck and many other people, we were able to go up on the Hill and convince them to actually, Ed Parkinson, who was working as a staff member to your member of Congress from Staten Island. Peter King.
No, actually, Peter King from Long Island. Yes,
Long Island. Oh, sorry, I thought he was from Staten Island. Okay.
No, I wish, but no, he was on Long Island.
Yeah,
but
he was the chair. Of House Homeland, and with the effort of
Ed Parkinson, who eventually became the CEO of FirstNet, right?
I was going to get Ed played a lot of roles over the history of us, but he was I will call him a young kid at the time because he was, but he was a young staffer, and actually ended up, draft that bill for Peter King, the chair. And that was our first bill. It was not the bill that we ultimately got, which was great, but it was at least got us in the door. Fast forward to, there's a lot of discussion amongst all the agencies in the federal government. Where does this belong? Is this really going to work? So we have this meeting in July. I'm going to say it was either 2010 or 2011, where we invited, basically, there was 500 people, and we had difficulty finding a room in DC because it was, we needed a big space. And we ended up going out to Herndon because there was an American Medical Association meeting in DC, which had all the rooms taken up. So we're out in Herndon at the Crown Plaza. And it was one of those defining moments that we talk about where we had basically every federal entity involved, including the chief technology officer for the White House, a new position, Anish Chopra, and thinking, hey, look, why can't the carriers just do this? And so that gave me a great opportunity. I stood up. We were in town to testify anyway the next day, but I was in uniform and stood up and I asked the representative from Verizon, Don Birmingham, said, "Look, would you ever provide, as has been mentioned here in this meeting, you know, priority preemption, ruthless preemption to public safety on your commercial networks?" And I was fully expecting him to dance and go off in different directions, but he didn't. He actually answered after a brief pause. He said no, and then people went, "Whoa!" That's what the members that were present from the folks in the administration thought they should do. And he said no, and I said, "Well, why not?" He says, "Because it's not in our shareholders' best interest." And people were kind of murmuring. I said, "No, that's a reasonable answer for it's not in their shareholders' interest, and that's who they they have to respond to." And I looked over at Jim Bugel from AT&T and I asked him the same question, and he goes, "We have the same answer. It's not in our shareholders' interest to do that." And at that point, I think the administration realized, you know what, we're probably going to have to give this to them. Then that transitioned the discussion to, okay, so if we were to do this, how would we do this, and what would it look like? And then they put it back on us, which is another one of these amazing things, that we had such a good group of people representing all of the associations for the next several months coming up. What does this look like?
You make a very, very important point there about them putting it back on us, because, they expected us, and rightfully so. If we really wanted this, they expected us to carry the water on this and to get this thing accomplished, right? Because they were not going to tell us, although some people tried to, what we needed. We knew what we needed, right? And it was our obligation to deliver to them a concept of solution that made sense. Would you agree that that's basically their expectation at that point?
It is. And not only was it the expectation then, if you think in any issue moving forward for anybody trying to approach the federal government for a large expenditure for public safety, or quite frankly anything, is you better have a suggestion, not only just a suggestion, but an idea, a strong idea of what it should look like, and then get support for whatever that idea is. And the bigger the project, the more difficult that can become to do. You add to it in our current circumstance, or the circumstance we had back then, I should say, is that nobody had ever built a nationwide network like this with priority and preemption. Basically, how would it be run? How would it be funded? What's the business model? And frankly, you're talking to police chiefs and fire chiefs and people that are good at what they do, but they aren't necessarily the business people that run telecommunications networks. So that led us to discussion among many topics is, okay, who's going to run this thing? If we fund it, if we give you the spectrum, if we fund it, how are you going to manage it and make sure that it's successful over time? And what kind of board are you going to have? What kind of oversight are you going to have? And it came down to this: is they asked us, do you want to run the whole thing? Two questions. They asked, do you want us to require everybody in public safety in the U.S. to use this network? To which we said no, and I'll cover that in a bit here. And then the second one was, who should be on the board? Do you want it to be a majority of public safety? And we had discussed this at length to say, is that the wisest choice? We're all good at what we do, but we're not telecom people. So we said no. We would like to have a significant presence, a large number with significant representation from police, fire, EMS, different parts of the country, geography, discipline, those kinds of things. But we need people that are business people, that understand finance, that understand telecommunications, those folks who, they're not going to be paid to speak of, at least not what they're used to being paid, to all help run this nationwide network. That's what we came up with. It was a great model. It's a great model today, I will tell you, despite some people thinking perhaps otherwise, that it's not as strong as it could be. It was formed and people agreed with us. That's a good way to do it. Make sure you have public safety's interest at heart. That's the core of this thing. It's a public safety network, right? But then also have a business model that makes it affordable, and that's something that can be refreshed, that we're not always going to be behind. You think about the LMR networks that local jurisdictions were having to build and spending millions, if not tens of millions of dollars to build for individuals. You'd have a bunch of, it's a lot of duplication.
So can we drill down into that? So I think we knew, there were components of how we built networks that were going to be key to the success. But as you said, this was a new technology to us. It was LTE and then now 5G, right? And and we wanted to follow that technology. Why? Because we got the economies of scale, we got all the research and development. would apply to our network as well as their networks, right? But one of the things I think that was really critical to this was a huge departure for public safety, and that was the commitment to a public-private partnership. So can you talk about that concept and how that developed into what exists today, right?
Sure. Yeah. And let me back up just to hit the point you mentioned earlier. Is, look, we were used to building our own networks because we needed reliability. I mean, we needed mission critical ready equipment and infrastructure.
How to work in the worst of situations.
Yeah, no matter what happens, when a copper firefighter needed help, they could push the button, key their mic, and they could get what they needed. And again, it's always been great technology. You and I are both older school in that regard, and we lived and died by that. New technology came along, LTE. Certainly the wireless community had come a long way, but the towers are different. I mean, coverage for an LMR tower is a lot greater than perhaps a wireless network. They have a lot more towers in a lot different areas. So it's a different technology. We came to realize, and I was one of these folks, you and I think both were saying, hey, we need to build our own network. If you tried to build a greenfield network with brand new cellular towers and with the spectrum that we had, it literally probably would have been $60-70 billion. It was just, and we could never, keep it up. We basically have to refresh it over time and go back to Congress to, for more money. And that was not going to work. And I finally came to that realization. I know, Chuck, you did too. And the rest of us said, look, a private-public partnership for people who do this for a living and know how to do it and do it well. Let's engage with them. They get access to the D block as part of the deal. And then we get to use it 100% time, all the time on our own spectrum. And then what the board did, and you were sitting on the board when you did that, is when they put out the RFP, I believe, they basically said, hey, look, rather than do an RFP that says, this is your technical requirement to fill and build us this, they did something completely different, which I think was brilliant, which was to say, this is our desired outcome. How would you propose to do this? So they invested literally a couple of years in getting the vendors and the carriers all together to say, what would this look like in the best case scenario to make it work? And in fact, that's how they ended up with the private-public partnership. They put it out to RFP. AT&T won that with one of the key functions, or one of the key aspects of their proposal, is that not only would we get to use all of our spectrum all the time, when we weren't using it, they could use it and monetize it, therefore creating a revenue stream for us, and they would be responsible for refreshing it. We never could have done that as a standalone network, never, ever.
And so that was a huge departure. And to get everybody in the PSA, the Public Safety Alliance, to agree to that concept was not easy, simply because it's just something public safety had never done before. But what's been uniquely successful about it is we were able to convince everybody, right? And then the other side of that is that it has created a mechanism of self-funding for the network. So the PSA was as unique as it was as an entity representing all of public safety. It was even proposing an even more unique solution. I think it's safe to say that. We agree with that, Chris?
Oh, absolutely. It was the only solution, quite frankly. Again, because not only we were trying to do something never been done before and didn't have the experience ourselves to do it, but having a leadership, having a governance board that oversaw an effort, a public-private partnership with a nationwide carrier who understood what we were trying to do, and did it in such a way that we would have recurring revenue coming from them for the use of the public safety spectrum, and then having to reinvest that to continue to build out the network and refresh it as we went from 4G to 5G to 6. And also, as we have mentioned before, the most important thing for a network is coverage. People say, hey, look, I want it to be faster. I want coverage. When somebody needs help or they need access to information, whatever, whether you're in rural America and in the forest someplace, or whether you're in Manhattan, you have to have the ability to get through. And so you have to continue to build out the coverage. And the only way you do that without having to go back and ask for more money is to have a revenue stream off what you have, a very valuable piece of real estate, which is that spectrum that we had.
And Chris, you just touched on something that was a real sore point that we had to overcome in Congress. And you testified at the time when you were chief. I testified as an assistant chief. Jeff Johnson testified as a chief. And one of the big sticking points was, we're going to give you this radio spectrum, but sure as God makes little green apples, 2 or 3 years from now, you guys are going to come and say, well, we don't have enough money to build this network. And so we need billions and billions of dollars more. So the public-private partnership really, really answered that congressional concern, which was a legitimate concern.
The funny part was, fast forward. First of all, it had not been done before, this type of public-private partnership. So the members of Congress, when they were asking us about, who's going to make the decisions on these billion-dollar, decisions on where stuff was built and what infrastructure, that kind of thing, they were pretty clear. They said, look, we're about ready to invest in you $7 billion in cash and $20 billion worth of spectrum. Please forgive us if you think that we probably want to have a little bit of oversight on this, which is absolutely an appropriate thing to say for something that had never been done before. Contrast it with with where we are now. It's wildly successful, and you have over 30,000 and public safety agencies using FirstNet, and you literally have, I think it's close to, 8 million subscribers, something. I mean, it's just in a short period of time has really, there's been tremendous uptake. I will say this though, Sue Swenson, who was the board chair at the time when they were just finishing up the RFP, and it was an oversight hearing in the Senate, I believe, where she was asked as the chair, are you going to get this thing up and running on time? And will you be able to do this on a sustainable basis with money that you have coming in? And she said something that I think Chuck and I both, we winced at when she said it, but we appreciate it as much as we appreciate her. And she said, look, if we can't, we should all be shot. That was her answer. And we said, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for that. But the truth of the matter is, as a telecom executive, she goes, hey, we had the money, we had the spectrum, we had the drive, we have a public safety mission, we're going to do it. And she did, and the board did. So
so that was everybody on Congress, there was nowhere to go after that answer. It couldn't have been more definitive.
Yeah.
So again, the PSA was a tremendous success. We were able to keep that together, right? And now, just before we close here, right? So where is the PSA gone now? It's kind of morphed into the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association and the Public Safety Spectrum Alliance, right? Which has looked to protect spectrum resources and the FirstNet network for public safety. So if you could just touch on the most important pressing issue right now, which is reauthorization of FirstNet, which is a clause that was built into the original 2012 legislation. Go ahead, Chris, please.
Right. So back up again, just to say that part of that oversight when we were there, so we're going to hand you $7 billion cash, $20 billion in spectrum. We're not going to make it permanent. We want to come back just in case it doesn't work. And so we understood the need for reauthorization over time. Congress does this for large projects all the time. So here we are. We're approaching the February 2027 deadline for reauthorization. Congress has stepped up in a big way, and I will say this: over the last 6-8 months, we have seen tremendous support in Congress, both houses, both parties, bipartisan, to reauthorize FirstNet. Now, there have been a couple of things that have been brought up with respect to things that have gone well, and because there's a lot that's gone well, and hence the need for they all recognize to reauthorize. The question is, is there a need for additional oversight or some tweaks here and there? And that's what the legislation is that's under development now is facing. But I will say, on balance, everybody understands the importance of FirstNet and what it has brought to public safety communications. The question is, do we need to make tweaks? And I think that's where we're in the process of. But I will say the lessons that were learned, Chuck, that got us to this point, where you have to have, if there's a mission that needs to be addressed for public safety, and it's that important, it's mission critical, you got to have the right people in the room that understand the issue, and that have the authority to act on behalf of public safety organizations. You get them in the room, you get them to focus on what the issue is, get rid of separate the wheat from the chaff, move forward with what you need, get consensus, and then go to Congress and ask only for what you need. You're not asking for anything that's sort of way out there. You're asking for something that we use every day in public safety. That's your key to success. So whatever the next issue is, and there will be the next issue as we move down the road, you will not be as successful unless you get everybody in the room and come to some consensus on behalf of public safety nationwide. If you start to splinter off, and we've seen a little bit of that over the last year or so, you're not going to get very far, and that's not in the interest of public safety. I don't.
Yeah, to your point, Congress is never comfortable with public safety unless we come in with one voice, right? And it scares them, quite frankly, when we don't, right? So it's important, as we did in this experience, is the takeaways as you talked about from the PSA and what we did, and one of the key, to me, the most important takeaway of the Public Safety Alliance in those years into the run up to the legislation in 2012 was the simple fact that we spoke with one voice, right? And in doing that, we spoke with confidence, and we gave confidence to Congress to move forward, and to, quite frankly, to the administration at the time, the Obama administration, and their willingness to do this, because we spoke with one voice. And going forward, like you said, there will be other times in public safety where that voice is going to be needed to accomplish what we need. Listen, almost all emergency response, first response work is state and local. Not all. There are some federal first responders, but the reality is that state and local firefighters, sheriffs, EMS, police, we are the ones that respond on the emergencies. So if we need something in order to accomplish that mission, we have to speak with one voice. So Chris, I'll let you close with your thoughts on that, please.
No, it's absolutely the truth. And people say, how did you do it? I get that question a lot. So how did that happen? Hey, look, it was a problem to be fixed. There are no better problem solvers than those in public safety. We deal with things like this every day. This one just happened to be a big one. We had a little kick in the pants from Tom Frazier, says, you broke it, you own it. What are you going to do about it? I was fortunate, along with Chuck and JJ and Dick and the rest of the group, Harlan, that we all, it wasn't about egos. It was about what is the right thing to do. And I'll emphasize, we did not always agree. Quite frankly, we had some pretty, knockdown dragouts on a bunch of issues, but we all understood what the mission was. And so we all got to a point where we were all comfortable. To your point, we spoke with one voice confidently to Congress. They listened, and we got what we needed. Is it perfect? No. Is it ever going to be perfect? No. But that's why it's important that public safety work together and not at odds. Nothing gets accomplished that way. It makes it a lot harder than it has to be, I think, over time. But with that, I would say, look, in my entire career, and I had a great career, did a lot of great things and had fun, as did you, Chuck. I can look back fondly to say we probably did something that I don't know if we could do it again. But at the time, we had the right people in the right place with one mission, and we got it accomplished. So grateful for that effort, and grateful to you, my friend, for not only hosting this, but also for being there at the beginning when people said that we didn't know what we were talking about and we could never get it done. And there's nothing you can tell a firefighter or a police chief or a fire chief is that, you're not important or you can't get something done, because if we do nothing else, we'll get something done. It may not be the best thing, but we'll get it done. And in this case, I think it turned out just
our job is not to fail, right, Chris? And that's always our focus on anything we take on. And we were successful in this one, and this model that made us successful is a great model going forward for public safety. So Chris, thanks so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. I think we'll end this on a positive note here. And for those out there in public safety, please keep an eye on reauthorization for FirstNet. We need to get that over the finish line, and we're confident that we can if we stick together.
Thanks, Chuck. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.